When Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion was first announced, I have to say I was a bit skeptical. I know now that I was wrong to be, but if I'm being honest, I was a little skeptical. As someone who had played through the entire base game of Gloomhaven already, a campaign that took hundreds of hours over the course of a year and a half or 2 years with the same group, we had also played through Forgotten Circles, I thought, what's this going to offer me as a more experienced player? Not that the game was made for someone like me. The game was meant more as an introduction to the Gloomhaven universe. So what exactly is Jaws of the Lion and where does it fit into everything? Well, it is definitely the more introductory version into this big world of Gloomhaven that so many people have heard about, and yet a lot of people haven't really been able to fully enjoy. So whether you're an experienced Gloomhaven player like me, or you're a casual player, or you've never been able to try it but you've been hoping to get involved in this Gloomhaven world in some way, in this review I'm going to look at what this game has to offer you depending on what your situation might be. So although Frosthaven, what's supposed to be the biggest game in the series so far, is coming out later this year, and there was already Forgotten Circles, a small expansion, for the purposes of comparing games, I am going to focus mostly on base Gloomhaven to Jaws of the Lion. So what are the main differences? Well, to start, it's pretty much the same type of game in the sense that you have a character and you're going on an adventure, you gain items along the way, you're working with your teammates, that sort of thing. But there are some really key differences. The first thing I want to highlight is that this is a fully cooperative game rather than semi-cooperative, and they put that right on the front of the box so you know it. This does lead to some small rule changes. In the base game of Gloomhaven, it was semi-cooperative in the sense that you couldn't buy each other items, you couldn't trade items. It was like whatever gold you had, you bought for your items for yourself, and that was that. Because this is fully cooperative, you can't pitch in with players, you can't spend 7 of yours and 3 gold from someone else to buy an item, but you can buy items to give to other people. You can trade items between scenarios. If the party gains an item in the middle of a scenario, you can decide as a group who gets that item regardless of who actually opened the chest. So there's much more of a focus on the team aspect of the game. Now what about the scope of the game? So base Gloomhaven had, I believe, 95 scenarios, which was just wild. Jaws of the Lion has a much more lean, more focused 25 scenarios. And even playing through the campaign myself, which I'll note right now, I've only played through this solo where you play as 2 characters at once. I ended up playing 18 scenarios out of the 25, and that was with playing all the scenarios that were available to me. It was much more linear in the sense that, there's only a few parts in the actual arc of the scenarios where you can branch off, and it says, decide to go to this scenario or that scenario, and once you pick one, it might carry out an arc of 2 or 3 scenarios one way or one other way before they sort of converge back on the main path. So even just in terms of replay value, if you're looking to replay this campaign, chances are the second time around you will have already done almost all the scenarios before, you will have seen a lot of what there is to see compared to playing base Gloomhaven over again. At the same time, that makes it easier for newcomers, right? I mean, you hear a lot of people say this about Gloomhaven, which is, I wish this game had come out when I was in college or when I was a teenager or whatever. And I know a lot of people feel that way because the game system is there, it's so intriguing, it's so satisfying to play, but that base Gloomhaven was just such a big box and such a daunting prospect. And with these sort of leaner, tighter, more focused campaign, sure, you get a bit less that exploration, but it gives you the chance to actually dive in without missing any of the key gameplay. You still have the same, playing your 2 cards, taking the top of one ability with the bottom of the next. You still level up and gain new abilities. Almost all of that is still there. Where you lose some of the sort of epic scope again, where there's another difference, is there are no retirement goals. So you're only going to play as one character or one class for the entire campaign. For some people, that might be a tough prospect. For me personally, one of my favorite things about base Gloomhaven was the idea that when you get to retire a character and take over a new one. And obviously that doesn't, you're not going to feel like you get bored of a character necessarily because this is a much shorter campaign, but there's just a bit of when you get into this, you kind of know. It's not like in Gloomhaven where if you didn't like a character, you could specifically try to retire them and try to get to a new character quicker. In this, you're kind of stuck with the character you pick, but there is a bit more of an arc over the course of your campaign in terms of, the way your character levels up and the investment, and you can't just think, oh, well, I bought these items and I regret it, but I'm going to retire them soon, so who cares? No, your decisions do have more long-term lasting effects in this campaign, and that is something that I do really appreciate. And part of the reason for not retiring your class and taking over is because well, unlike base Gloomhaven, which comes with, I believe, 18 classes, 6 at the start and the rest are unlockable, this game only comes with 4, and they're all unlocked right from the start, so you can pick any character, but that means there isn't as much cool stuff to unlock along the way. Another big key with this is because it's an introductory game, it has a built-in tutorial, and I have to say this, from what I see, should now be considered the gold standard for board game, sort of built-in board game tutorials. I mean, the first 5 scenarios in this scenario book, which I'm going to get to in a moment, if you heard me talk about scenario book, the first 5 scenarios or so are laid out in a way where they introduce certain concepts, they give you a smaller deck of cards with some text that explains what the abilities do, and it really does feel like it's set up for people who have never played Gloomhaven before. It's not going to detract from the experience if you have played before. If you're the only one in the group and you're introducing some new players, it's not like your experience is going to suffer. They're fairly quick scenarios, but they really help sort of spoon feed you and get you into it one step at a time. One of the things I really appreciate about the tutorial, though, and where I think they really nailed it, is that you're still making progress. It's not one of those practice games where it feels like, oh, it was just kind of like to get a feel for how the game works or whatnot. When you finish the tutorial, your character is now level 2. You've gained something, you've progressed, so it doesn't feel like this just weird unnecessary step that's just treating you like you maybe need some help getting started. It is actually easing you into the game, and then you're already into your campaign by the time the tutorial's over, and I think that was brilliantly done, and for this type of game, it's key for making it so approachable for less experienced gamers who want to see what Gloomhaven really has to offer. And now going back to the scenario book for a second, here is a major difference. There is a scenario book in here where you basically open up the page, it tells you which monsters you need, and the map tiles or the map itself is right there. You can see exactly where the map is. Sometimes you need a supplemental scenario book where you add on another page to the end to expand the map, but you have the map in front of you. Sometimes, it can spoil something, like you look over to see an enemy on the page and you accidentally see what the reward was for that scenario, or you see, some upcoming surprise that you're not supposed to have read yet. So sometimes it might hamper your experience in a slight way because of that. But honestly, for me personally, I would take that any day over having that longer setup and all these extra map hexes to put together. So I think the scenario book is a fantastic addition. I bought Jaws of the Line knowing I was going to be sort of locked down over the holidays, and I played through this entire thing solo as the Demolitionist and Hatchet over the course of a few weeks. And I have to say, I think it works extremely well as a solo game. So I'm going to talk about how it plays differently solo versus 2 to 4 players. So the first key thing is that you're playing 2 characters instead of 1. So for your own decisions, rather than just looking at one character's cards and deciding what cards you're going to play, you have to then set those aside and look at your other character's cards and decide. So there is more to consider. Your turns are going to take longer. Your own individual turns will take longer than if you were playing in a group, but you also have more control over what's happening. Personally, I really liked that. I liked the idea of having a little bit more control over what was going on, but because of that, I increased the difficulty level in order to make up for it, because if I was going to be able to plan to do an exact amount of damage to an enemy, then I want that enemy to have more health to offset it. So if you find that playing solo might be a little easy, you can just up the difficulty to offset that. So what this means when playing solo is that each scenario on its own will probably take a bit longer because you don't have someone else thinking at the same time as you. You pick that one action and then you're looking for the other. So I did find playing solo, some of the scenarios could take upwards of, 2.5 hours, especially if you're sitting there really plotting out your moves, but at the same time, you can go at your own pace when playing solo and you don't feel like you're slowing anything down. The original Gloomhaven did an excellent job of bringing you into this world and making it feel like its own little universe with its own set of rules and systems and magic and whatnot, and these unique characters, and you learned about the Inox and the Quatrals and all this. In the base game of Gloomhaven, though, I found the story or the narrative arc itself was a little lacking for me personally. And I have to say, even though Jaws of the Line is a step up in pretty much every regard of, world building, storytelling, and all that, it still does fall a little bit short for me again in that whole sort of story arc sense. I loved going through the city events after every scenario, and you're reading these little descriptions, these little events that happen, and you're trying to piece together. They were really challenging, and a lot of them I ended up getting the negative results out of, and they were frustrating. But at the same time, they were really rewarding when you made the right choice on one of those city events, and it really made you feel like you had an active role to play in this universe. I just kept looking for these little things like these city events and these little nuggets that made me sort of, again, feel more immersed in the world. Even the cards for the characters themselves have little sort of inside jokes to something that are, you know, one of their weapons they're holding or whatnot. You've got the descriptions of all the characters on the back of their individual player boards. Again, everything pulls you into this world. It's really well fleshed out, but the story sort of narrative over the long term could have been a little better for my liking, which also leads to sort of another disappointment of mine, which was the final boss. And again, this was another issue I had with base Gloomhaven, was by the end of the campaign, I felt like the final boss, I mean, you invest how much time into a game like this? I mean, this one's a lot less, obviously, but base Gloomhaven and this, you invest a ton of time into this long campaign, and the boss wasn't anything for either game, and I'm going to focus on Jaws of the Lion because this is what we're talking about, but it wasn't anything that really stood out to me as memorable, both in terms of the challenge or, you know, how interesting it was to fight against. So when you invest in so much into such an epic game, you do sort of want maybe a bit of a better payoff. It didn't overall maybe hurt my feelings of the game in terms of how I remember it, but yeah, that is something worth pointing out. So just back on the topic of replayability for a second. Like I said, when you're done this campaign, there's going to be very few mysteries left. Unless you didn't play with a couple of the characters in the box, chances are you've seen a lot of the character cards, you've seen a lot of the items, you've played most of the scenarios, so there might not be a whole lot of mystery left. But if you're still part of the Gloomhaven universe, you're going to be playing other games, whether it be the base game or you're going to be playing Frosthaven, you can carry over these characters and a lot of these items and things over into other Gloomhaven games. So if you're, you know, if you wanted to dabble in this universe and you think this is a good starting point and you might be making the jump after this to Gloomhaven or Frosthaven, the value is going to carry over even more long term. Overall, the good far outweighs the bad here, and I have very little reason to complain. I mean, sure, the campaign ended with a bit of a whimper for me, and maybe I was looking for a little more story, and maybe it wasn't quite as exciting as the original base Gloomhaven. And, you know, going back to what I started with at the beginning, maybe dungeon crawlers aren't even designed really for me. But even so, I still played through this solo the entire campaign by myself over the course of about 3 weeks. I could have stopped at any point, and even though this type of game usually isn't for me and I'm not actively seeking out dungeon crawlers, this game was just so good that I had to play it through all the way to the end. So even though I likely probably wouldn't play through the campaign of Jaws of the Lion a second time myself, that's probably in large part because I've already played so much Gloomhaven over the past few years. And I have to say that after having played that, I did not expect to enjoy this much. It's a fantastic game, and the whole Gloomhaven universe is just something iconic in our board game industry that not everyone has been fortunate enough to be able to experience. So if this is your starting point, or if you've enjoyed Gloomhaven games in the past and you're not sure if there's enough here, well, put those fears to rest because they've absolutely knocked it out of the park with Jaws of the Lion. It's a perfect introduction to this game in our hobby, and I think you owe it to yourself to try this out. So thanks for watching. See you around.